Alright, so I've taken a long-deserved break, and so has the King of the Monsters himself. Let's finish off these Godzilla reviews with the Heisei era of Godzilla and the Millennium era. The Return of Godzilla came out in 1984 and is a reboot of the Godzilla franchise. And when I say reboot, I don't mean a full-fledged reboot like Batman Begins. It's more like a soft reboot because it ignores all the movies from Godzilla Raids Again to Terror of Mechagodzilla, but is a direct sequel to the original Godzilla from 1954. So despite the fact that in Japan it's just called Godzilla, it's not a remake. The movie opens up very similar to the original Godzilla though. A ship in the waters of Japan is suddenly attacked by a mysterious figure, and it's actually kind of ruined already because we hear Godzilla's roar. But then again, this is the 16th Godzilla film, so we kind of know it's Godzilla. And there's one sole survivor on that ship who's brought back to Japan, and is pretty much confirming that what attacked the ship was indeed Godzilla. And this news makes its way up to the Prime Minister, who believes that Godzilla has returned. Throughout this whole movie, they never acknowledge that this is a second Godzilla. We'll get into that with a future review. They just assume that the same Godzilla is back. But they decide to keep this a secret from the Japanese public, and they bar any news organizations from leaking this information. That is, of course, until Godzilla attacks a Russian nuclear sub, and the Russians pin the Americans on the attack. Keep in mind that this was made in the 80s during the Cold War, because there was all the tension going on between America and Russia, and Japan was literally right in the middle of it. So in order to avoid the possibility of nuclear war with Russia nuking America, Japan breaks the news and says the Americans did not destroy the nuclear submarine. It was Godzilla, and Godzilla has indeed returned. So the Japanese Self-Defense Force preps for Godzilla's arrival to Tokyo, and it wouldn't be a Godzilla movie if he didn't arrive in Tokyo and started destroying the whole city. The Return of Godzilla is a very interesting movie for me personally, and when it comes to the franchise as a whole, because this was the movie that I actually discovered Godzilla through. It wasn't the first Godzilla movie I've ever seen, but I remember back in the days of Blockbuster, I was wandering around the entire store looking at all the VHS covers, and I stumbled across a videotape for this film's US counterpart, Godzilla 1985, and there's something about that cover that just intrigued me. What is Godzilla? What is this? It was this giant monster over a city with airplanes, this weird spaceship looking thing, a giant fireball. It looked really cool, but I was a little scared to see it because it was a monster movie, and in my mind, it was kind of a horror movie. So this movie was probably about the 10th Godzilla movie I saw, and it definitely left an impression on me. Keep in mind, I saw the American version beforehand, but I'm going to be talking about the Japanese version first, which had a mission statement to make Godzilla scary again. Tomoyuki Tanaka wanted to revive Godzilla and pretty much bring audiences back that were kind of alienated after all the goofy Godzilla movies from the 70s, and he even approached Ishiro Honda to direct this film, but Ishiro Honda was working with Akira Kurosawa on co-directing some of his later movies, and he felt like the Godzilla series should have been put to rest after the death of Eiji Tsuburaya. And Akira Ifukube didn't come back to score this movie as well because he had retired after Terror of Mechagodzilla. But Tanaka was still dead set on making this movie and reviving Godzilla because in an interview with People magazine a year after this movie came out in Japan, when he was talking about the character change for Godzilla in the 60s and 70s, he said, quote, "This character change was responsible for his decline. It was a mistake." And I could just imagine Yoshimitsu Banno reading that and going, "Motherfucker! You mean he blamed me for ruining Godzilla with Godzilla vs. Hedorah?" And then years later he says, "Yeah, that was a mistake to make Godzilla a little more lighthearted." But you know what? Props on Tanaka, the director Koji Hashimoto, and special effects director Teruyoshi Nakano, because this definitely brings Godzilla back to his roots, and it results in one of the scariest Godzilla movies out there. I absolutely love The Return of Godzilla. I'm going to say right now, I'm not going to give it my get off your ass and go see it rating because I did have some issues. But rewatching this movie again, especially now that I can watch it with English subtitles, in terms of the Godzilla series, it is a masterpiece. This movie has Godzilla going solo, so if you're disappointed that there's no monsters for him to fight this time around, then you gotta understand that this is not the kind of movie. This is not about fighting other monsters or just simply destroying cities. It's bringing Godzilla Godzilla back to being a metaphor for nuclear Armageddon. In the original Godzilla, he was a metaphor for the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this movie, because it takes place during the Cold War, he is very much a metaphor for the events of the Cold War. And when I reviewed this movie 5 years ago, I said that the subject matter is effective, but outdated by today's standards. I want to officially take that back, because I feel like with what's going on in the world right now, given the fact that America, Russia, and North Korea have leaders that are just out of their goddamn minds, we are kind of in a new Cold War. So when watching this movie with that mindset, the politics in this film is so fascinating. Because after Godzilla's return is made public, the Japanese Prime Minister calls the ambassadors from America and Russia to meet in Japan to discuss ways of getting rid of Godzilla. And surprise, surprise, both sides decide to use nuclear weapons against Godzilla, which the Japanese Prime Minister refuses to because Japan has a nuclear policy where they won't manufacture, hold, or use nuclear weapons. Sure, they have nuclear power plants, but they will never ever use nuclear weapons. And the big statement that the Prime Minister makes is, if Godzilla appeared in US and Russia, given your egotism with using nuclear weapons, would you actually bomb your own country to try to get rid of Godzilla? So it's a powerful message that nuclear weapons aren't really the option. Because if we had a problem in our own country, if there was a war going on in the United States, would we even consider using nukes on our own country? So it's definitely powerful, and it's a great way to bring Godzilla into a more modern era. Because as I mentioned before, he started out as a metaphor for Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, but you really have to update Godzilla every time you bring him back. That's why when it came to Shin Godzilla, he was a metaphor for the tsunamis, earthquakes, and the Fukushima meltdown in 2011. They were updating Godzilla to fit what was currently going on in Japan. And Godzilla himself is pretty terrifying. It goes back to the more traditional Godzilla where he's a menace. His spines are bigger than beforehand, he has 4 toes instead of 3, and the score, while not done by Akira Ifukube this time around, is effective. I always consider 1984 the year to have really effective and creepy horror or science fiction scores, like Nightmare on Elm Street, The Terminator, and The Return of Godzilla. And not only does the score serve as a great background for Godzilla as he's rampaging through the city, but it's also effective in showing the paranoia that the country's going through with Godzilla's return. There's a sequence when Godzilla is spotted off the shore of Japan heading to Tokyo, and we see the paranoia of everyone packing their bags, leaving. There's crowded streets. People are getting on bullet trains that are overcrowded. People are heading to the airports and flying out of Japan. This movie does a really great job of showing how menacing Godzilla actually is. And then the action scenes are phenomenal. As I mentioned, Teruyoshi Nakano is the director of special effects again. He did the special effects for Godzilla vs. Hedorah through Terror of Mechagodzilla, and because he was given a much bigger budget this time around, it allowed him to make Godzilla scarier. It allowed the suit to be more detailed, it allowed all the miniatures to be more detailed, and it actually allowed him to make a giant animatronic Godzilla, which has been dubbed the Cybot Godzilla. This animatronic was actually influenced by the 40-foot tall King Kong that was built for Dino De Laurentiis' remake. And just like with the 40-foot tall Kong, this Cybot Godzilla had a lot of problems going through it. Well, for one thing, it's easy to tell what's the suit and what's the Cybot Godzilla just based on the head, because the Cybot Godzilla has a longer snout, and the suit has a shorter snout but looks meaner. And also, the way this Godzilla moves is, for lack of a better word, very robotic. It doesn't feel very natural, and it doesn't compare to when you see Godzilla in a suit, who this time is played by Ken Satsuma, the same suit actor who played Hedorah and Gigan. And because of the sort of stiff and robotic movement, it definitely makes the animatronics look kinda garbage by today's standards. But there are points in the suit, admittedly, where Godzilla has this kind of derp look to it. And yes, I made that joke in my original review, but overall, I think this is one of the scariest Godzilla movies out there. I did have some other problems with this movie. There are a few shots throughout the film that feel like they go on for a little too long. You just want them to trim it down a bit. And there's a weird subplot in the movie where there's this homeless guy going around Tokyo as it's abandoned, as Godzilla's going on the loose. He invades this very high-class restaurant that's in a skyscraper. Godzilla peeks in through the window, and the homeless guy's yelling at Godzilla. It's weird. It's supposed to be played for laughs, but it doesn't really work because this homeless dude just comes out of nowhere. And then the movie goes on for a little longer where you even forget that he's there. But on the whole, this is definitely one of the best Godzilla movies and one of the scariest. It does a fantastic job of updating Godzilla for the time it came out. The action scenes and special effects are fantastic, especially the big battle between Godzilla and this super weapon called the Super X. Since there's no other monster for Godzilla to fight, it is good that they have at least some sort of advanced weaponry that cannot exist to fight Godzilla. You notice that I haven't mentioned the characters that much. They didn't really leave an impact on me the way the characters in the original Godzilla did, but the politics of this film and just the overall special effects are fantastic. When I reviewed this movie back in 2013, I said that it was the only Godzilla movie that had yet to be released on Blu-ray or even DVD in America, and since then that happened. So this is absolutely worth seeing in your lifetime. The Blu-ray is dirt cheap. You can find it on Amazon. Definitely see it because it is one of the best Godzilla movies made. The only bummer about the movie being released on Blu-ray, and I guess this ultimately depends on your opinion, is that the American version, Godzilla 1985, is not included. But for me personally, it's not that big of a loss because Godzilla 1985 was the American version that we got in the United States, and it is awful. I'm a big fan of Corey Coleman and Double Toasted, and back in the Spill days, when he was hosting a show with the artist formerly known as co-host, they got a question about Godzilla and what the top 5 Godzilla movies are, and the person writing the email listed Godzilla 1985, and both Corey and co-host said, "Oh, that movie's fucking horrible." And yeah, it is horrible, but that's the American version. The reason Corey Coleman, the reason Roger Ebert, the reason all these critics bash Godzilla 1985 is because they're basing it off what they saw, because this version right here almost butchers what the original version stood for. For one thing, they brought back Raymond Burr in this movie, which is a nice touch that they would bring back the original actor from the American version of the original Godzilla King of the Monsters. But he has jack shit to do in this movie, and on top of all that, he looks so damn bored in this film. In this whole movie, he's referred to as Mr. Martin because around this time, Steve Martin was popular, so you really can't call him Steve Martin. But he's brought into the Pentagon to offer advice on how to stop Godzilla because he was one of the sole survivors from his attack. In this version, they say 1956 because that was when King of the Monsters came out. But he offers no advice whatsoever. He is downright useless. All he does is stand around in the Pentagon in his suit. Every line of dialogue he spits out are monologues. He literally contributes nothing to this movie, and he's in America the whole time. He never once goes to Japan, because at least in Godzilla King of the Monsters, he was in Japan. The reason you had him in that original version was to offer an American perspective. In the Return of Godzilla, the Americans are already playing a big part in this movie, so you don't need the Pentagon involved as well, because you already have the Americans playing a role in the original version. And what pisses me off even more about these new scenes in this version is one of the soldiers within the Pentagon. You have this one military personnel who, the best way I can sum him up is if he was a member of Donald Trump's cabinet, where he is a fucking idiot, and the only reason he's there is because he's a millionaire or something. I'm making my own backstory for this guy. When the Japanese break the news of Godzilla's return, he looks at a photo of Godzilla and makes a joke about how the government should put Godzilla in a US uniform, sign him up for the military just because he destroyed a nuclear submarine, and he calls the monster Wonder Lizard. There are many points in this movie where he is shamelessly promoting Dr. Pepper. He's just drinking a can of Dr. Pepper, and it should be noted that Dr. Pepper was a sponsor for this American version, which is ugh. But the most offensive thing for me is when Godzilla finally makes landfall in Tokyo and is destroying the city. Everyone in the Pentagon is looking at it in awe and shock and horror, pretty much. And this one guy looks at all the footage and goes, "That's quite an urban renewal program they got going there." And I'm like, fuck you! Having that line of dialogue in there completely undercuts what Godzilla represents. Now, one thing I'll give credit to Raymond Burr, as much as he did not try in this movie, he at least was against that line. Now, the original intent for the American version was to make it more of a Woody Allen comedy, which Raymond Burr was completely against, because he at least understood that Godzilla was supposed to be menacing. So again, he didn't even try in this movie, he's terrible here, he's useless, but props to Raymond Burr. Now, one other grossly offensive change that this movie makes involves a Russian nuke. There's a sequence in the movie during Godzilla's attack where a Russian cargo ship is on Japan's coast, and that has the controls for a Russian nuclear missile, which the Russians turn off after the Japanese have said, no, you can't use nuclear weapons. Now, in the Japanese version, Godzilla damages the ship, and that starts the countdown for the missile to launch at Godzilla. One of the Russian personnel on the cargo ship tries to stop the launch, but he dies doing it, and the missile launches on its own. The Russians acknowledge that this was an accident, and the Japanese call on the United States to try to intercept the missile and destroy it in space. And that really does play into Honda's theme of unity, because the director of this movie was actually an assistant director on some of Honda's lighter films, like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster and King Kong vs. Godzilla. So he had close experience working with Ishiro Honda. But in the American version, they completely change it. Instead of the Russian guy dying trying to stop the missile launch, he purposely allows the missile to launch by pushing a button and then dies right before it launches. And what's even worse is that they still try to pass this shit off as if it's an accident. I'm like, no, motherfuckers, we saw the guy hit the missile button. The only reason they did this is because, again, it was the Cold War. There was a lot of tension between the United States and Russia, so I imagine that this American version did that just to spite Russia. I mean, granted, we're in a very bad spot with Russia now, but come on, at least have a little bit of dignity. But Godzilla 1985, I will admit, has some things that I do like. Some of the shots that go on for a little too long in the Japanese version are trimmed down for a better pace. There's a moment in the Japanese version where there are still civilians running throughout the entire city as Godzilla's on a rampage. Even when everyone gets the word that the Russian nuke is gonna hit Godzilla after he's unconscious by the Super X, there's a whole crowd of Japanese civilians looking at Godzilla. They don't even evacuate, and the US version changes that. I would normally say burn in hell, because there are legitimate points in this movie that really did piss me off. And I would say that if we didn't have access to the Japanese version. This is like my argument for Godzilla King of the Monsters. With that version, if we didn't have access to the original Japanese Godzilla, I would have said that that movie was good but not great. But we do have access to the Japanese version, and King of the Monsters fails in comparison. Same thing with Godzilla 1985. If we didn't have the Japanese version of The Return of Godzilla, I would have said this movie can go burn in hell. But we do have the Japanese version. That's actually the only version that we have access to because the US version has not been released on DVD, and I don't think ever will due to copyright reasons. So just don't waste your money on it. It's not a good movie at all. It does have some improvements here and there, but all the changes in this movie are downright abysmal. It is not a good version at all. But the only other good thing that I could say, probably in its defense, is that at least it didn't do a complete 180 like Gigantus the Fire Monster did. But yeah, when anyone says that Godzilla 1985 is terrible, I can appreciate that. But The Return of Godzilla is truly one of the best Godzilla films made, and it might be my favorite in the second series. We'll see how the rest of the reviews pan out, but I really love The Return of Godzilla. And even though this was the first Godzilla movie within the Heisei era of Godzilla movies, it was made during the Showa era in terms of Showa Japan. And then when Japan changed emperors, that is when the country moved into the Heisei era. And the next movie we're going to be talking about tomorrow was the first Godzilla movie made in Japan's Heisei era, Godzilla vs. Biollante. So until tomorrow, I hope you enjoyed this review. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on the movie, if and when you've seen it. And as always, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.